forward. I do hope that we can go to conference and work together with the Senate to come up with a bill that can really pass and sequestration be eliminated. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Florida.
Madam Chairman, I'm very pleased to yield 4 minutes to the very distinguished member from New Jersey and an important member of our subcommittee, Mr. Frelinghuysen.
Gentleman from New Jersey, recognized for 4 minutes.
Madam Chair, Mr. Chairman, thank you for yielding me the time. I rise in strong support of our defense appropriations bill. Under Chairman Young's leadership and collaboration and strong support from Mr. Viskovsky, our committee held a lengthy series of hearings examining varied topics: our operations in Afghanistan, the so-called pivot to the Asia-Pacific, the Army and Navy's need for modernization, Navy shipbuilding, Marine end strength, military health care, acquisition reform, sexual assaults, among other important issues, and of course the impact of the sequester, the negative impact. Most of our hearings related to reducing risk in the defense budget and the new strategic guidance from the Department of Defense, protecting our gains as well as preparing for current and future threats. China's growing military capability, continued uncertainty in North Korea and that peninsula, the destabilizing civil war in Syria, Iran's race to develop nuclear weapons capability, and their threat to close the Straits of Hormuz, among others. Our goal throughout this bill is to provide the resources to support our warfighters now and in the future, whenever the next crisis arises. Mr. Speaker, our subcommittee, like other appropriations subcommittees, clearly recognizes the nation's debt and deficit and found areas and programs where reductions were possible without adversely impacting our armed forces and our modernization efforts. Frankly, it is important that we find savings without harming readiness or increasing the risks incurred by our warfighters. Under Chairman Young's leadership, our committee had a close examination of military needs and the very necessary oversight. So our legislation before us includes funding for critical national security and intelligence needs, based on a very strong hearing process. In addition, the bill provides essential funding for health and quality of life programs for all of our men and women in uniform, all volunteers and their families. They deserve nothing less. I want to thank the Chairman, the Ranking Member for their leadership. I strongly support the bill and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Indiana.
Madam Chair, I would yield myself such time as I may consume, and in doing so would want to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Farr, to enter into a colloquy.
Gentleman from California.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Chairman, I rise to strike the last word and to wish to engage in a colloquy with the Chairman and the gentleman from Indiana on the issue regarding timelessness, accuracy, and review of security clearance processing. I would like as the Chairman is aware, security clearances are necessary to protect our national security and are required for thousands of jobs. However, the length of time to conduct the investigations, the quality of the investigations, and the continuous review of approved security clearances are 3 areas that could be improved. I believe that there is a solution to all 3 of these concerns, and it involves the leveraging of automated investigation tools already in existence. The Defense Department has within its subordinate activities the Defense Personnel Security Research Center, known as PERSEREC. It has researched and developed a number of automated tool sets that can reduce the time it takes to adjudicate investigations, to grade the quality of the investigations, to measure the human error, and to provide a way to monitor and reaffirm granted clearances based on an analysis of human behavior. These computer programs could dramatically increase the quality of the investigations while at the same time saving money and shortening the time it takes to both approve and reinvestigate security clearances. These tools are already available today, but they have not been leveraged. Instead, the majority of security clearances are being investigated by antiquated, analog adjudication process that just doesn't reflect the best research and development readily available to the Department of Defense by PERSEREC. I greatly appreciate the Chairman and Ranking Member of the Defense Subcommittee have included within the report language encouraging the Department of Defense and the Office of Personnel Management to use these automated tools and systems readily available for the security clearance process. Would my colleagues agree that the security clearance process should incorporate proven tools that ensure increased efficiency and quality?
I would note to the gentleman from California that with the recent concerns regarding security clearance processes for the Department of Defense and intelligence communities, I appreciate him bringing to our attention that the Department can increase the timeliness and quality of investigations and reinvestigations by using the Defense Personnel Security Research Center tools.
I thank the gentleman for his response.
The gentleman from California yield.
Yes, sir. Yes, Mr. Chairman.
I'm aware of the gentleman's deep interest and appreciate his proposed solution in finding ways to address this issue. Like my good friend from Indiana, I agree that we should work with our friend Mr. Farr to ensure that the Department of Defense and the Director of National Intelligence in leveraging the security clearance research at PERSEREC to improve the precision and speed of investigations, and that is exactly why we included it in our report.
Thank both of you for your friendship, your leadership, and your cooperation.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Indiana reserves his time. The gentleman from Florida.
Madam Chairman, I yield to Mr. Turner of Ohio 3 minutes for the purpose of engaging in a colloquy.
Gentleman from Ohio, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your commitment to enter into a colloquy. I rise to speak about the Abrams tank. The Appropriations Committee has wisely included funding in the last 2 years for continuing to upgrade the Abrams tank. That action kept the Abrams production line warm and preserved a critical industrial capacity. However, there is no funding, as I understand it, in the FY 2014 Defense Appropriations Bill for additional tank upgrades.
Madam Chairman, the gentleman is correct. The administration's budget request for fiscal year 2014 includes no funds for the production of Abrams tanks, and the committee bill provides none. The Army is only now addressing the funds added for fiscal year 13, and production of the M1A2s will actually continue until December of 2014.
Mr. Chairman, I understand that earlier in the year, both the administration and others believed that foreign military sales alone may be sufficient to keep this production line running. Those sales have not yet materialized, and I remain concerned that we are risking a critical national asset based solely on anticipation of foreign sales.
Well, foreign military sales have helped sustain a warm tank production line. Despite the delays and uncertainties in the FMS process, it is very likely that FMS sales will continue to play an important part in sustaining the tank line.
Mr. Chairman, I understand that the committee intends to wait until the Army announces its force structure changes and then assess the need for additional upgraded tanks. While I respect that position, I think that whatever changes the Army makes, we will still need to keep that smaller force as effective as possible. The way to ensure that is to provide that all remaining Armored Brigade combat teams with M1A2 SCP tanks.
Madam Chairman, I appreciate the points raised by my colleague. We will continue to monitor the overall requirement for tanks in both the active Army and the Army National Guard. We intend to relook the issue of additional Abrams upgrades as we move forward in the appropriations process. We will have the benefit of more complete information on foreign military sales, and the Army's force structure analysis, protecting the industrial base will remain a critical issue.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your continued interest and your support in this matter, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Ohio yields back his time. The gentleman from Indiana.
I would reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Florida.
We have another colloquy with Mr. Bishop. Right here.
How much time we need for that one?
3 minutes.
Oh, Madam Chairman, I yield 3 minutes to Mr. Bishop for the purpose of a colloquy.
Gentleman from Utah recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I know my friend from Florida shares my concerns regarding our nation's nuclear deterrence, and specifically in preserving the sea-based leg of the nuclear triad in the Trident II D5 submarine-launched ballistic missiles, which are carried on the Ohio-class submarines. The current fleet of ballistic missile submarines is planned for service through the year 2042. And the D5 missile they carry is expected to remain viable much longer and will see service on the replacement platform. I hope the chairman agrees.
I do agree, and the gentleman is correct.
So the original design of life of the D5 missile rocket motors was 25 years. Some of the currently deployed motors are reaching that age, and the missile requires a life extension to maintain viability. Does the chairman agree that the life extension program of the D5 missile is critical to ensure the missile will remain the highest level of reliability for as long as our nation requires it?
I would tell the gentleman that I do agree. I would add that the ending of the space shuttle program has also exacerbated the hardship to the industrial base, and agree that the Navy's D5 program is now cornerstone of the nation's solid rocket motor production. I feel that it is essential that the Navy sustain a steady production rate of 12 rocket motors per year as the minimum level to ensure that replacement motors are available to replace aged-out motors, as well as to keep this unique and highly skilled engineering and workforce viable into the future. The industrial base has done a Herculean effort in downsizing and becoming more efficient in the face of the declining workload, as enhanced by the attractive pricing they provided the Navy on a recent motor contract. I will work to ensure that the Navy has sufficient funding to maintain at least the minimum production required to sustain this critical industrial base.
I thank the chairman and compliment him for his great work on this issue, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Utah yields back his time. The gentleman from Indiana.
I would reserve my time.
Gentleman from Indiana reserves. Gentleman from Florida.
We don't have any more speakers. We have no more speakers.
We have no further speakers, Madam Chairman, so I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida reserves. Gentleman from Indiana.
We have no further speakers, and I would yield back my time.
Gentleman from Indiana yields back his time. Gentleman from Florida.
Madam Chairman, I am happy to yield back my time.
Gentleman from Florida yields back his time. And all time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule, and the bill shall be considered read through page 157, line 2. No amendment to the bill shall be in order except those printed in the House Report 113-170, the amendment described in Section 2 of House Resolution 312, and amendments en bloc described in Section 3 of that resolution. Each amendment printed in House Report 113-170 may be offered only in the order printed in report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and the opponent, may be withdrawn by the proponent at any time before action thereon, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. After disposition of amendments printed in the House Report 113-170 and amendments en bloc described in Section 3 of House Resolution 312, it shall be in order for the Chair of the Committee on Appropriations or his designee to offer an amendment reducing funding levels in the bill. It shall be in order at any time for the Chair of the Committee on Appropriations or his designee to offer amendments en bloc consisting of amendments printed in House Report 113-170, not earlier disposed of. Amendments en bloc shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 20 minutes, equally divided, and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations or their respective designees, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The original proponent of an amendment included in such amendments en bloc may insert a statement in the congressional record immediately before the disposition of the amendments en bloc. After the conclusion of consideration of the bill for amendment, there shall be in order a final period of general debate, which shall not exceed 10 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking member, minority member of the Committee on Appropriations. It's now in order to consider Amendment Number 1, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan rise?
I have an amendment at the desk, Madam Chairman.
And the clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Wahlberg of Michigan.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. In light of recent events in Benghazi and North Africa, the Pentagon approved the development of the Special Purpose Marine Air-Ground Task Force for Crisis Response to function under United States African Command. This task force is specifically tailored for crisis response in Africa, in April deployed to Spain and Italy. The unit is capable of responding to a wide range of military operations and will provide limited defense crisis response in support of embassies, support non-combatant evacuation operations, provide humanitarian assistance, and assist with disaster relief operations, search and rescue, and other missions as directed. As this force is ramping up, I believe we need to ensure this valid and important mission is completely and adequately funded. With the rise of Islamic militant groups in Mali, Nigeria, and Somalia, and continued unrest in Egypt, Libya, and Algeria, the threat is real and growing. The committee has added funds for sustainment and follow-up deployments in fiscal year 2014, but there are substantial concerns that the need may be higher. Funding for this force was not requested in the President's budget, but was included in the House-passed NDAA. I'm hopeful that in establishing a funding source and signaling congressional willingness to support this mission, the Marine Corps will be better able to assess their needs and provide us with a more exact funding request. To work towards a sure state of readiness, I'm offering this budget-neutral amendment to increase this funding by $10 million while reducing funding to the Operations and Maintenance Defense-wide account by $11 million. During consideration of the NDA last month, an amendment was adopted by voice vote that would increase authorization for the Crisis Response Force by a similar amount. To provide an additional military response in case of another Benghazi-type situation, we must ensure that the Special Purpose Marine Air Ground Task Force Crisis Response can properly respond to threats to our diplomatic posts in an expeditious manner. And with that, I yield back my time.
The gentleman from Michigan yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida? Gentleman from
Madam
Florida
Chairman,
is recognized.
for the reasons that the gentleman has already outlined, the committee had already added $30 million for the Special Purpose MAGTF, crisis response teams, as well as an additional $35 million for the new Marine Corps Embassy Security Program. The gentleman is exactly right. We're not doing enough on this issue, and we are certainly in support of his amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida yields back. Any other member? The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan, and those in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from...
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Madam Chair.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Delaney of Maryland.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Delaney, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield myself 2 minutes. My amendment responds to a common dilemma facing our military families, a dilemma that is deeply unfortunate but easily solvable. When our warfighters and veterans head to the hospital, their families often face a choice between being there or paying their bills. This means that too often our military heroes are in the hospital alone, without the support of their family. They deserve better. This amendment will increase funding for Fisher Houses, which provides free housing for the families of patients receiving care at military and VA hospitals. This additional funding is offset by a corresponding reduction to the defense-wide operation and maintenance account. Thanks to Fisher Homes, when our heroes are in the hospital, their families have a place to stay. Thanks to Fisher Homes, when our military families need our support, we lend them a helping hand, a home away from home. This program is not only compassionate, but it's cost-effective. Since 1990, over 180,000 families have been served by Fisher House, saving military families over $200 million. However, you can't put a price tag on the emotional, psychological, and spiritual value these homes provide. After 2 years, we have seen resources strained and backlogs developed. We can't expect better results without improving our support structure. This amendment would lead to the construction of at least 4 new Fisher homes next year. 4 new homes means lodging for 2,000 military family members. That's 2,000 sons, daughters, wives, husbands, brothers, sisters that can be by the side of our military heroes during their most significant time of need. No veteran, no service member should head to the hospital alone. I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
I would claim the time.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Chairman, the Fisher House program is one of the real success stories. It was initially started by Mr. Zach Fisher, and after his death, the family continued. The need was so great at the military hospitals, but also at the VA hospitals, there were no Fisher houses. And so the program was expanded, and we increased our involvement. The Congress had not been involved up to this point, but Congress appropriated money, and we've been appropriating $4 million a year to add to the Fisher Foundation for the purpose of the Fisher houses. We also allow for $11 million for transfers to the Fisher House operations. As I said again, it's a real success story. And while it's additional money, we're happy to support the gentleman's amendment and make sure that the Fisher houses continue.
If the gentleman would yield.
I think I'm yielding to the good lady.
The gentleman from Florida, controls the time.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The gentleman from Florida controls the time.
Well, who has the time?
Gentleman from Florida controls the time.
I will yield to Mr. Visklosky if I think he was seeking.
I appreciate the
gentleman from Indiana recognized.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding. I do not rise to oppose the gentleman's amendment, but to cast a caution over the expenditure of the proposed funds. The bill contains $4 million, and this is a phenomenal program. I am not in any way suggesting otherwise. But the gentleman's amendment is quadrupling funding in 1 year for this project from $4 million to $20 million. So I would hope that the people that are running this program understand in a time of great fiscal constraint they better very carefully, effectively, and wisely spend this additional money that I'm not objecting to, but very concerned about quadrupling $4 million that is already in the bill for a very good program, and I appreciate the gentleman for yielding.
And I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida yields back. Gentleman from Maryland.
I'd like to yield 1 minute of my time to the gentlelady from Nevada.
Gentlelady from Nevada, recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I rise in support of the Delaney Amendment. As a member of the House Veterans Affairs Committee, I understand the important role that the Fisher House plays in supporting members of our armed services, our nation's veterans, and their families. In southern Nevada, a brand new VA hospital opened recently to serve the 154,000 veterans who live in our area. Just north of the hospital, there is land that has already been dedicated to a brand new Fisher House. I support this amendment because it will allow Fisher House Foundation to build an extra 4 houses this year, including the one in Las Vegas, helping an extra 2,000 families. The Fisher House Foundation received an A+ rating from the American Institute of Philanthropy, so we know that our money is being used efficiently and effectively to make a meaningful difference in the lives of our heroes and their families. I look forward to a day when members of the armed services and our veterans will all have their families close to them as they receive the medical care at these facilities, including the new hospital in Las Vegas. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Maryland.
I appreciate the comments of my colleagues and the support of my colleagues. I have no other comments. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland. Those in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Now, in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Hawaii seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 3, printed in House Report Number 113-170, offered by Ms. Gabbard of Hawaii.
Pursuant to House 312, the gentlewoman from Hawaii, Ms. Gabbard, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
The U.S. Navy has acknowledged a growing problem that threatens its dominance at sea. Its strike reach is shrinking and aging, while potential enemies' attack reach is growing and modernizing. We recognize this most specifically within the Asia-Pacific region. It's because of this growing recognition that the Navy is exploring new weapons in order to successfully execute our strategic rebalance of military assets to the Asia-Pacific region. A long-standing Navy urgent operational needs statement and related intelligence estimates detail a troubling capability and readiness gap that have compelled the Deputy Secretary of Defense to direct accelerated development of an over-the-horizon surface warfare missile that can be launched from aircraft or surface vessels and strike well-defended, moving maritime targets. Currently, surface-launched anti-ship missiles face the growing challenge of penetrating sophisticated enemy air defense systems from long range and present the potential for large no-go zones which deny the Navy access in key conflict areas. The military expects our adversaries will continue their development of increasingly sophisticated anti-access area denial capabilities that are able to jam or destroy GPS systems which guide our missiles. This clearly highlights the need for the offensive anti-surface warfare weapon, as well as the long-range anti-ship missile, which has a requirement of independently detecting and validating the target that it was shot at. In authorizing the full request in the President's budget, the House Armed Services Committee noted the need for a new generation of anti-ship weapons capable of penetrating sophisticated enemy air defense systems from long range, and said such a capability is even more relevant today and is critical to meeting national security objectives and rebalance to the Asia-Pacific region. By providing these new capabilities, we allow our Navy to safely engage and destroy high-value targets well beyond the potential counterfire range of the adversaries that they may face. I recently received a letter from Admiral Locklear, commander of U.S. Pacific Command, who's at the forefront of this rebalance to the Asia-Pacific region, noting the importance of these two weapons. He expressed deep concern about the reductions proposed by the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee and said that such reductions will derail the efforts of Pacific Command to outpace an expanding threat, increasingly degrade our regional response options, and potentially erode regional confidence in our commitment to the rebalance. We can and must do all that we can to correct the significant strategic and operational risk that these budget cuts present at this critical juncture. I urge you to support the President's budget request as well as the authorization that the House Armed Services Committee approved in order to keep this essential element of our Asia-Pacific rebalance on track for fielding. I look forward to working with my colleagues and ask for their support. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves her time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Madam Chairman, I'd like a clarification on the time issues. Since the time is structured, is it possible for the person offering the amendment to reserve that time when they haven't completed their statement?
The gentlewoman may reserve. Does the gentleman seek time in opposition?
Okay. Well, then I will claim the time.
The gentleman's recognized.
Very simply, most of this money would be taken from the Special Operations Command funding. It's not a good idea because we're using the special operators more and more all the time. We are finding them involved when you were places where you might be surprised. And I just don't think it's wise for us to be taking this funding from the special operations. We remind us that special operations are the Navy SEALs and the special teams that go into difficult places. We prefer not to put a limitation that this amendment would cause. And I'll yield to Mr. Visklowski.
The gentleman would yield. My understanding as well during subcommittee consideration is that the New Start proposed, and this is a New Start proposed for 2014, provided very little explanation or rationale, and that's from the Department of Defense. And the committee recommendation was for a reduction because of the poor justification by the department itself. I think I'm correct in my understanding.
And I thank the gentleman for his comment.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding.
I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Florida yields back his time. Gentlelady from Hawaii.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. A couple of points that I would like to clarify is this amendment proposes that the offset come from the O&M defense-wide account, but makes up less than 0.5% of the entire amount requested in funding for that. With regards to the justification for the timing of this issue, the letter from Admiral Locklear, which I will introduce into the record.
Objection. That will be covered under general leave.
Thank you. The contents of that letter recognize the effectiveness and necessity of these programs and are looking really to bypass normal acquisition processes due to the urgent need that they have identified there within the region, which is why I'm strongly asking my colleagues to consider supporting this amendment. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Hawaii. Those in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Madam
Gentlelady
Speaker,
from Hawaii.
I request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Hawaii will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 4, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Grayson of Florida.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Grayson, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This amendment would increase the Defense Health Program account by $10 million in order to fund a cure for Gulf War illness. Currently, there is no cure for Gulf War illness, and it affects over a third of the veterans who served in the first Gulf War. This amendment is identical to an amendment offered last year that passed this body by a voice vote, and according to the Congressional Budget Office, this amendment actually will reduce total outlays by $1 million. Veterans of the first Gulf War suffer from persistent symptoms including chronic headaches, widespread pain, cognitive difficulties, debilitating fatigue, gastrointestinal problems, respiratory symptoms, and other abnormalities that are not explained by traditional medicine or psychiatric diagnoses. Research shows that as veterans from the first Gulf War age, they are twice as likely to develop Lou Gehrig's disease as their non-deployed peers. There also may be connections to multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's disease. Sadly, there are no known treatments for the lifelong pain and affliction that these veterans must endure through this disease. For decades, the Veterans Administration has downplayed any neurological basis for this disease, but recent research just this year has shown unequivocally that this disease is biological in nature. The time has come to right the wrong that our servicemen and women have had to live with this disease for over 20 years. In this Department of Defense appropriations bill, we allocate more money for breast cancer, orthopedic, and prostate cancer research than we do for finding a cure for Gulf War illness. Equivalent funds are appropriated for ovarian cancer research. Personally, I think that if we're going to spend money on medical research within the Department of Defense, the Department must adequately fund research on those diseases that originate in war and wholly affect our servicemen and our servicewomen. Over 250,000 of veterans display symptoms of this disease, and the time has come to find and fund a cure for it. The offsets for my amendment today come from the $32 billion Operations and Maintenance Defense-wide account, and that account is funded at $500 million above the amount in last year's DoD appropriations bill. Congress has a responsibility to ensure that the Gulf War veterans who put it all on the line and are paying for that with a lifetime of pain are not left behind. I urge my colleagues, including my esteemed colleague from Florida, to support this amendment and to help to find a cure for the Gulf War illness. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida reserves his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Yeah, Madam Chairman, I will claim the time.
Gentleman is recognized.
Although we're going to support this amendment from my colleague from Florida, but I take this time to point out that we already included an additional $20 million for the program, the same amount that was included in fiscal year 2013. Prior to 2013, the subcommittee typically included $8 million to $10 million annually for this program. But this bill this year for 2014 has an additional $20 million. But it's a serious issue, and it's one that we can't take lightly, and so we do support the gentleman's amendment. And I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida.
I want to thank the gentleman from Florida for accelerating the efforts to find a cure for this disease. I'm very grateful to him, and so are thousands of veterans. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. And the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor will signify by saying aye. Opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
We're done.
Israel 5 was any on block. So if he offers it, it can't be on block. have been already disposed of under the rule. So, keep going off.
It is now in order to consider amendment number 5, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 5, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Israel
Madam Chair, I
of
ask
New York.
unanimous consent to dispense with the reading.
Without objection, pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Israel, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will be very, very brief. Madam Chair, this is a bipartisan amendment offered by my colleague from New York, the gentleman from the 2nd Congressional District, Congressman Peter King, and myself, to transfer $10 million to mental health programs within the Department of Defense. It is fully offset. Madam Chair, 22 veterans every day are committing suicide. 273,000 veterans have been diagnosed with traumatic brain injuries since 2000, and the pace of post-traumatic stress disorder is going to require new thinking, new innovations, new technologies, new partnerships, and new collaborations. That's exactly what this bipartisan amendment crafted by Congressman King and myself does. It creates new public-private partnerships between the Department of Defense and teaching hospitals and research institutions for the research, the treatment, and outreach on military mental health matters. This is not a matter of partisanship. This is a matter of doing the right thing for our veterans. It was my honor to work together on a bipartisan basis with the gentleman from New York, Mr. King, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Madam Chairman, I claim the time.
The gentleman is recognized.
Actually, this moves money around within the Defense Health Program for something that the committee has worked a long and hard time over the years dealing with the subject of traumatic brain injury and psychological health research. In fact, we included an additional $125 million in the bill above the President's request because of the importance of the issue that we're facing. We are seeing more and more cases of TBI, traumatic brain injuries, than we had expected, I believe. So we added the additional money that the gentleman's amendment would move around in the DHP, so we have absolutely no problem with this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana?
The chairman might yield for a moment. I appreciate the gentleman's remarks and would also mention to the
Be
body...
happy to yield to the gentleman from Indiana.
I appreciate
Indiana,
the chairman.
recognized.
I simply appreciate having the time, first of all, to associate myself with the remarks that you have made on behalf of the gentleman's amendment. Secondly, to note that, as you point out, the subcommittee itself has done significant work and recognizes the problems that we face in the commitment we need to make to the individuals that the gentleman is trying to help with his amendment. So again, very much appreciate the gentleman's remarks as well as support for the issue and this particular amendment.
Madam Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida yields back. Gentleman from New York.
Madam Chair, I would just close by thanking the gentleman from Florida, the chair, and the ranking members for their cooperation. This amendment is so vitally important to those who are fighting for our freedom. In this amendment, we defend the defenders and we protect the protectors, and I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for their support for this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York, and those in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Madam Chairman, pursuant to House Resolution 312, I offer amendments en bloc.
Clerk will designate the amendments en bloc.
On block number 1, consisting of amendments numbered 6, 32, 76, 77, 78, 79, 80, 81, and 82, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Young of Florida.
And then you can reserve.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Young, and the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Visclosky, will each control 10 minutes. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Madam Chairman, the en bloc amendments has been agreed to by the minority and the majority. There are non-controversial amendments that covered topics such as suicide prevention, traumatic brain injury, and National Guard issues. The sponsors of the amendments have agreed to the amendments being considered en bloc, and I would ask for the adoption of this amendment, and I reserve my time.
From Florida reserves his time. And from Indiana.
I would yield a minute to the gentleman from Washington.
Gentleman from Washington recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the ranking member for yielding. Within this en bloc includes an amendment that highlights a very troubling breakdown within the Department of Defense, how they collect and process their personnel data. Our brave men and women who are deployed overseas rely upon the Service Members Civil Relief Act to give them assurance that they won't need to worry about a foreclosure on their house, a lease being terminated, or outstanding credit card debt. We ask significant sacrifices from our troops, and this is a needed helping hand at a time when they are rightfully focused on serving their nation. In order to provide these protections, financial institutions are required by law to consult the Department of Defense's data system to validate service members' deployment. This system is called the Defense Manpower Data Center, or DMDC. I've heard from a number of stakeholders that the DMDC is riddled with inaccuracies because each service feeds their own data into the database with no standardization between services, and much of it was originally entered by hand with little to no quality assurance. Obviously, this creates a significant problem. We need our financial institutions to have accurate data so that troops can get the benefits provided by law. I'm extremely concerned about the reliability of this data for the purposes of SCRA compliance, and for that matter, any other personnel processes affected by the DoD. Going forward, I hope we can work together to address this serious data problem within the DoD. My amendment would cut $1 million to the Defense Human Resources Activity Operation and Maintenance defense-wide account and reinsert that funding into the exact same place, with the intent of encouraging a study on how the Defense Human Resources Activity components and the CIO identify, catalog, process, communicate, and rectify mistakes or inconsistencies found when data is uploaded to the DMDC. I want to thank Chairman Young, Ranking Member Visclosky for working with me on this issue, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from... what purpose is the gentleman from Indiana?
I would be happy to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from California.
Thank you. Gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This amendment considered en bloc would provide the Department of Defense the flexibility to train and equip Wildlife Reserve Rangers to help combat illicit poaching across the African continent. Poaching and wildlife trafficking are not only a matter of conservation, but a matter of international security. As the ranking member of the Africa Subcommittee, I'm deeply troubled by the damaging impact poaching has on the economic stability of African nations. During my travels, African heads of state and ambassadors have expressed that poaching erodes the tourism industry, public safety, and regional security. Various newspapers have reported that poaching and wildlife traffickers are more dangerous and militarized than ever before, with armed militias like Kony's Lord Resistance Army and al-Qaeda affiliates fueling conflicts with the profits from poached ivory and other animal products. The Department of Defense can play a leading role in helping to provide the training required to protect wildlife and put an end to regional conflicts and instability fueled by poaching. Training in reconnaissance, apprehension, and effective field communication will better prepare park rangers. I look forward to working with the chairman and ranking member. I yield my time.
Gentlelady's time's expired. The gentleman from Florida.
Continue to reserve.
Reserves his time. The gentleman from Indiana.
It does not appear that we have any other speakers on our side, and I would be prepared to yield back my time.
Also, I am
That's a
prepared to yield back.
I would yield back my time.
The gentleman from Indiana yields back his time. The gentleman from Florida
Yes, ma'am, I yield back.
yields back his time. The question is on the amendments on block offered by the gentleman from Florida, and those in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, the ayes have it. The en bloc amendments are agreed to. The chair understands that amendment number 7 will not be offered. It is now in order to consider amendment number 8, printed in House Report 113-170.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Rhode Island seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, with number 8 in the report.
And the clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 8, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Langevin of Rhode Island.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before I begin, I want to first congratulate the chairman, gentleman from Florida, and the ranking member for their important work on this legislation before us today. Madam Chair, it's no surprise to any of us that the United States Navy, with its critical role in our national defense, faces ever-increasing global threats and a significantly resource-constrained environment. In maritime regions of economic and military importance to the United States, the Navy requires disruptive technologies that can be rapidly developed, demonstrated, evaluated, and fielded to counter other nations' expanding undersea capabilities and to extend the Navy's research and reach and persistence. The Advanced Submarine Systems Development Program supports innovative and promising undersea technologies, including unmanned undersea vehicles, or UUVs as we know them, for the delivery of new and needed capability to the undersea domain. However, under the current acquisition plan, the Navy may not have new technologies it needs to meet requirements in this domain until after 2020. So my amendment reduces the appropriation for operations and maintenance defense-wide Office of Secretary of Defense by $22 million and transfers this amount to RDT&E Navy for the purpose of supporting advanced submarine systems development. This represents a funding increase to the level authorized by the Armed Services Committee and this House in the fiscal year 2014 National Defense Authorization Act. It has been scored as reducing outlays by $3 million by CBO. Unmanned systems such as the Predator in the Air Force provide increased performance for many missions and have truly revolutionized modern air warfare. Autonomous undersea vehicles can add significant capabilities to the Navy systems and platforms and act as a force multiplier for long-endurance, hazardous, or high-threat missions where humans are limited in mission success. In response to a question I asked at a hearing earlier this year for the Armed Services Committee, Navy Secretary Lehman stated that, and I quote, "These underwater systems, UUVs and USVs, can be relatively more useful in undersea warfare than their airborne counterparts on the surface in air forces." While the Navy recognizes the promise of these technologies at a time of shrinking budgets, new technologies without existing bureaucratic and industry supporters tend to suffer disproportionate cuts and cancellations compared to programs with political and bureaucratic constituencies and must be actively protected by Congress, end quote. So with this, Madam Chair, support of this program will help accelerate the integration of UUVs and other autonomous undersea technologies and payloads into the Navy for the full spectrum of military needs and potentially speed the eventual availability of these capabilities to civilian purposes such as energy exploration and environmental monitoring, just as happened with aerial vehicles. My amendment accomplishes this in a fully competitive way, accelerating rather than disrupting the existing development process and enabling earlier support of COCOM-defined operational needs. With that, I urge support of this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Rhode Island reserves his time. The gentleman from Florida, for what purpose does he seek recognition?
Madam Chairman, as much as I want to support my friend's amendment, I can't. This,
gentleman
first
is
of all, the money
recognized for
that
5 minutes. It's recognized for 5 minutes.
The money that he would use for a large part, comes from the Special Operations Command. And I just don't think that we can restrict them like some of the amendments that we're seeing in their ability to move about the world as they have to move about the world and do the exciting things that they do. But the gentleman's amendment adds $22 million to the $32 million that we already included for this program. Now, that is a 63% spike in funding for fiscal year 2014. That makes it very difficult for the program managers or anybody involved with the program to assume a 63% increase. Means that maybe a lot of new jobs this year, but then the next year they'd all be fired, laid off, because the money is not there. This is not a consistent program, except for the $32 million that we have included in this bill. And so, as much as I would like to support his bill, his amendment, I really can't. I just don't think the program managers can handle a 63% increase in this, frankly, any program. So I reserve my time.
Gentleman from Florida reserves his time. The gentleman from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the comments that the Chairman had just made. I'll just point out that in the Defense Authorization Bill, this was authorized at the higher level, and the information I have from program managers that they could in fact absorb and make important use of these funds in speeding these technologies to the warfighter and enhancing our undersea capabilities. With that, I would urge my colleagues to support the amendment, and I would reserve the balance of my time.
Time? For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
I continue to reserve.
Continues to reserve. The gentleman from Rhode Island.
I'm prepared to yield back the balance of my time, Madam Chair.
Gentleman from Rhode Island yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Florida.
I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida yields back the balance of his time. And the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Rhode Island. Those in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 9, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
Madam Chairwoman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 9, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas.
I thank the chairwoman. I'm hoping to convince my colleagues that, albeit what numbers you may have in this increasing and emerging epidemic of post-traumatic stress disorder, let me give a personal story that comes by way of my interaction often with veterans, and particularly a post-traumatic stress disorder center that we were able to fund in a hospital that previously had not had the ability to serve active duty soldiers and veterans. It's a small hospital off the campus of our main Veterans Hospital in Houston, Texas. But we established a post-traumatic stress disorder center there that allowed veterans who may not have traditionally been at the Veterans Hospital, not because they did not have benefits, but for a variety of reasons, to find a comfort place to be treated for their post-traumatic stress disorder. And they were not just veterans of the Afghan and Iraq wars, but these were ones from the Persian Gulf, from Vietnam. And they could not thank the staff and could not thank the work that we had done to secure just a small amount of dollars, which this amendment does. This takes a small amount of dollars from a very large funding for certainly a commendable challenge, but it is one that I believe would benefit as we seek to create a better quality of life for our soldiers, wherever they might be, and our veterans. This is a $500,000 deposit, if you will, on the high numbers of post-traumatic stress disorder. I have seen it in our returning soldiers. I have seen it in our veterans, and it is clearly something that is not going away. I think the pointed story that I want to share is how grateful this particular veteran was who said he had never been to treatment and his whole life had been turned around. His wife was there with him. She said their lives have been turned around. So I ask my colleagues to consider the responsible approach that we have taken for just this amount of money to reinvest in our very needy but deserving men and women who are both active duty. In the instance of the story that I gave, because this facility was able to utilize TRICARE, they could serve active duty and they could serve those who were veterans as well. So I ask the chairman and ranking member for their support along with our members. I reserve.
Gentlelady reserves.
She reserves.